This is Sorrel Hillman, and we are going into the fourth in a series of 10 informal discussions with John Mason Brown, a distinguished author, critic, and lecturer, on the general subject of the humanities. And during this talk, we are going to examine that most elusive of things, laughter, concerning which an outstanding humorist, E.B. White, once wrote, "Humor can be dissected as a frog can, but the thing dies in the process, and the innards are discouraging to any but the pure scientific mind." Well, bearing that admonition in mind, Mr. Brown, what is laughter?
I would instantly have to take exception, because it seems to me that humor is not the only cause of laughter. It's only one of the agents that prove provoking or provocateur. We have to go into wit, humor, nonsense, all kinds of things, burlesque, to come to the causes for laughter. What is laughter? Laughter is one of the nicest sounds that can be released by a human throat. What a purr is to a cat, what a song is to a nightingale, laughter is to a contented or happily discontented heart. It's the vent of comment. Let's go back to Mr. White. One of the most tiresome things in the world is try to analyze laughter. Do you remember, Mr. Hillman, a book called The Enjoyment of Laughter?
By Max Eastman.
By Max Eastman.
Mm-hmm.
It was a good book, a solid book, a solemn book. And the only thing, as one reviewer pointed out, that was really laughing in that book was the photograph of Mr. Eastman on the cover. Because once you began to analyze the sources of jokes, or the origins of jokes, or the causes for laughter, laughter evaporated. Now, of course, there have been many theories of laughter. Some up to a point tenable, but only up to a point, never all the way through. The famous one is an essay delivered first as a lecture by Henri Bergson, and it's printed in this country under the original title of Laughter. And in that essay, Bergson points out what he calls the mechanical or mechanistic theory of laughter. His theory being that the human body is only a machine, and anything that runs contrary to the machine or throws the machine out of order is what causes laughter. As an illustration, he offers, for example, the solemn man dressed in his Sunday best, wearing the high hat, who slips on the banana peel. And the fact that that man, looking that impressive, shouldn't fall, does fall, and is, after all, the victim of only a dropped banana peel, is one of the age-old causes of laughter.
The humor of incongruity.
Incongruity, which he would say is the mechanism thrown out, and that works again and again. When you have the reversal of expectancy, or the downfall of pride or pretension, that is the common denominator for much of the sources for laughter, whether the release is wit or humor, or the epigram or the wisecrack, or any of the things that I trust we shall discuss.
The classic photograph of J.P. Morgan at the Senate committee hearing with a midget in his lap. Again, incongruity. The mighty, dignified financier looking ridiculous.
It was so accepted, it always seemed to me not so much an example of incongruity, example of how a press agent can succeed. The man was not working for any press. He was working for a circus and against Morgan. But it was a superb and hilarious photograph just because Mr. Morgan was so dignified. Yes.
Are there any other theories, apart from the Bergson theory, that
well, there is, to me, a theory that which has to do with wit and the true causes of the more sophisticated forms of laughter that I think a theory far better than Bergson's. And I now go back to George Bernard Shaw. Shaw said that people laughed at what he wrote because it happened to be true. And people were frightened by the truth. They never expected to hear it, and were so embarrassed when they did hear it that they thought anyone who spoke it must be witty. Therefore, they laughed to relieve themselves of the embarrassment of having to confront what was unpleasant. And he said that he was mistaken as a wit when he was only a truthful observer. Of course, that isn't true either.
To a certain extent, it may be true of Shaw. I can't think of very many other people it's true of.
Well,
you?
Yes, he would say in the case of Voltaire or Chesterton, or anyone who has said something that is uncomfortable, when you stick the match under the fingernail, when that sensitive area is touched, and heaven knows that in all forms of living or activity, there are enough sensitive areas to be touched. When once you feel that discomfort, which truth can be in this case, then Shaw says, instead of screaming as you do in the case of pain, you laugh. May I go back to, again, the physical form of laughter? Do you remember George Mary's famous essay on laughter?
Vaguely.
On comedy. It was The Comic Spirit.
I remember it was terribly unfunny, or so I thought.
Well, it wasn't attempting to be funny, and maybe you haven't read it for a long time, and your values have changed since then and grown. Because what he was trying to say is exactly what you would agree with, and I'm certain I would. There is belly laughter. There are jokes that come from pratfalls, that come from the simplest origins, which create the noisiest kind of laughter and one of the most delectable releases. But, said Meredith, the laughter of wit, true wit as a rule, is not noisy. And he described it in the famous phrase as thoughtful laughter, because in this case, it was the mind that was ignited, and the wit was percolative. It took some time to enter into the full consciousness of the mind, and then you wanted to savor it rather than to deafen yourself to it by laughing.
That's what he tried to write in his novels, isn't it?
Yes,
Do
he
you
did.
think he succeeded?
Not for us today. For his contemporaries, in Diana, he did.
I find him unfunny, but again, don't fashions in humor change tremendously over the years?
They change enormously.
Who today, for example, could really even begin to savor some of the so-called wits of the 1850s and 60s that Lincoln liked so much, who depended largely on misspelling, mispronunciation, complicated dialect for their humor? Petroleum Naseby and Josh Billings and all those people.
And I think this is a blessing. It's one of the few good things about our times. Dialect humor has gone out. And even Mr. Dooley is very hard reading today. But Lincoln was absolutely delighted with dialect humor. And so was his whole generation, so was the generation before and after. It has died for us because, in the first place, we can't read it. In the second place, we've come to despise the kind of racial attack that is implied in the print. The superiority looking down.
Or that we think is implied. It's an
Decency.
Unhealthy manifestation of this generation that we are so terrified of being thought repressive of the various minority races, that we are thought to be anti-Negro, anti-Jewish, or whatever, that we deliberately avoid anything that could even be thought to bring up a race.
Because so frequently we have become the victims of our decencies. We know what's wrong in the racial cleavage, and yet by suppressing all the truths that our ears tell us daily in the differences in dialect, we've also done damage not only to truth, but to humor, which is one of its releases. May I come back to the kinds of comedy and laughter? Because these things can have a coexistent life, even in one play. And no one was more the master of the various forms in one play than William Shakespeare. Let's turn to one of the plays that we all remember, Much Ado About Nothing. There you have the Beatrice Benedict scenes pitched on the high level of high comedy, and the Dogberry Verges scenes pitched on the lowest level of farce, sub-farce, of low farce, red-nosed, unashamed Minsky. Let me try to make that point clearer. When I speak of high comedy in the Beatrice Benedict scenes, what I mean is that you have here love scenes in which the emotion of love is denied. All the skirmish is from the mind. They attack each other as wits, not as suitors, and the only favors they seek are mounting insults. Now, Dogberry and Verges are quite different. They are the kinds of low comedians that you associate with physical discomfort, with drunkenness, with burps, with any horseplay that can win an easy laugh, and they're entirely legitimate. But Shakespeare reached out to get the upper laughter, the Meredithian laughter, in terms of physical laughter also. He was perfectly willing to use both means, and it seems to me he was right.
But do you think that Shakespeare really succeeded with his low comedy, with his clowns, with his buffoons, with his lesser Falstaffs?
Well, there are few things to most people more tiresome today than a Shakespearean clown. But that is because the taste in low comedy, at least, well, like the taste in dialect writing, have changed. They must have been funny in their time. I still have seen Hamlet revived when the first and second gravedigger can be enormously funny if played by gifted comedians. They're not funny in the text.
I wonder again if incongruity hasn't something to do with that. The mere fact that these men are engaged as gravediggers gives them, and whatever they say, a certain comedy that they might not have if they were first farmer, second farmer.
I think you're being unfair to undertakers. And I would not deny all of those who get rid of us with the right of comment or even of laughter.
Well, nobody should be better at comedy than undertakers.
Well,
low comedy.
They have the advantage because no one can answer back. That is their peculiar advantage. I want to go back to humor and to what I'm trying to reach for as high comedy, and again into period manifestation of this particular form of writing or expression. Humor, certainly as Hazlitt, as Lamb, as any of the great critics have described humor is a kind of glorious excess of bodily happiness. It is the body comfortable It is, well, it's Falstaff, only Falstaff is a humorist who is a wit. He is the crossing line. Wit has to do with the ventilation of the mind. That is the true comment of the seeing mind. Humor is kindly, whereas wit can be totally unsparing. But may I come to humor just for a moment, and to wit, and to Sir John Falstaff? I don't know how you feel about Sir John Falstaff, but
Fond of him.
fond of him, I love him. It seems to me he is the Hamlet of humor. It's this great fat man who looked really like a convention of tumors. And people were inclined to laugh at him merely because he was fat. This is, again, the physical incongruity. They laughed at him because he pretended to be a knight and always ran in battle, because he pretended to have been in battles and always lied about the skirmish that he had been in. But the wonderful thing about this man that Shakespeare so affectionately described as a gore-bellied knave, a fat-kidneyed rascal, an ale-soaked rogue, a capon-filled coward, a whoreson candle mine, an obscene, greasy tallow catch, was that above the flesh was this glorious sense of reality. If he was a coward, and he was, it was not because he was afraid, it was because he was wise. Everything that we are taught by the night courts, everything that we are taught in Sunday school, everything that we are taught by the recruiting officers, Falstaff refused to subscribe to. He was not ashamed to lie down in battle and let the brave men die. He thought it was better to lie down and stand up than to lie down and never get up and then be unable, therefore, to drink, laugh, and have the fun that he had.
So, in other words, you think his humor really stems basically from his wisdom?
I think the great fat body, which is a kind of candlestick for the flame that is lighted above, the body is the humor, the mind is the wit. He's one of the great wits, too. He is a greasy fellow. He is all these things. But he makes his pleasure ours, because he is one of the great realists in dramatic literature.
I think lots of people miss that in him. That brings me to another question. Don't you feel that basically there is a great deal of sense in what is normally considered nonsense?
Oh, I would think as Alice in Wonderland, or Alice Through the Looking Glass, or as Stephen Leacock at his best proves, that nonsense is no absence of sense. It is a retreat from sense as we ordinarily see it. It's like looking in one of those mirrors at Coney Island. I give you an illustration of what has always seemed to me a perfectly wonderful piece of nonsense of Stephen Leacock, that great good man. In a fine book, I believe it was Moonbeams from the Larger Lunacy, Stephen Leacock described the military position of a Southern leader. The story was called The Blue and the Gray. It was a pre-war Civil War story. And in it, somebody named Carey Eggleston Lee something or other had to report on General Grant's military position, as I recall. And he came faltering back into the presence of Marse Robert, and he said, "Sir, his right faces the river, his left flank faces the mountain, his front faces so-and-so, and his rear is on a cactus plant." And General Lee said, "A most uncomfortable position." It seemed to me that all military strategy was somehow, even for those who can't follow battle plans, too easily captured there.
Again, the use of sense to create nonsense.
Absolutely. May I give you a twist in the phrase of nonsense? A little couplet of David McCord, the poet and essayist. This is, I suppose, one of the shortest poems in history, and it seems to me one of the wisest. It's a poem addressed to a waiter, and all it says is, to a waiter. It's really a sweet little ode. To a waiter. By and by, God caught his eye. For anyone who's waited for a waiter,
Yes.
We know what that means. And the famous line of Robert Benchley, which, alas, his son Nathaniel said his father didn't say. I like to believe he did. You remember when he had come out of a Hollywood swimming pool, and he said, "Oh, how wonderful to get out of this wet bathing suit and into a dry martini." Which seems to be
Absolutely wonderful. One of, I think, Benchley's funniest, which his son says he did say, and he was there when he said it. Benchley was leaving a Hollywood nightclub, somewhat inebriated, and he saw a man in a glittering uniform and instructed him to call a cab. The man drew himself up indignantly and said, "Sir, I happen to be an admiral in the United States Navy." "All right, then," said Benchley, "call a battleship."
That is the divine Benchley story. I think that is wit. The other one, the martini, is also wit, but it's on the verge of a gag. But the wonderful quality of Bob Benchley was that though he was a wit, Bob Benchley rarely made anyone uncomfortable. I can't think of an instance when there was any cruelty in his comments or in his spoken comebacks or printed comments.
Well, and unlike so many wits or humorists, he was receptive to other people's humor.
He was the most generous listener in the world, and if anyone ever came up to Robert Benchley and said, "Isn't it a hot night?" Robert Benchley would laugh so uproariously that the person who had been guilty of weather talk felt as if he were Congreve who had suddenly come back to life. Now, Nathan was just the opposite. Georgie Nathan, who was a wit, was not a humorist. He could be a parodist in an excessive overdrawing, but he could devastate, and half the fun was the devastation of his comment.
Do you remember a typical one?
Oh, there was a one-line comment, and I will not name the actress, who played Camille, and it was mediocre and impoverished, poor performance. And Nathan said, in something like 45 years of theater going, this is the first Camille I have ever seen who died of catarrh. And that was the ultimate dismissal of that performance. But now let's come to the great, great English wit, the wittiest comic writer that England ever produced. For sheer wit. This is for comedy of manners, not social comedy such as Shaw. And I'm speaking of William Congreve, who wrote frankly of a special world, as did Van Broek, as did all the people who had gone before him, the comic dramatists of the Restoration, Wycherley and so forth. That world was a world of high, closed society. It was a court world.
The haut monde.
It was the haut monde, the final height. It was the Mount Everest of snobism, foppery, and a lack of ventilation, with the long curls and the cuffs and the snuff and malud and lud and all this. Let me come to what to read is the greatest comedy of manners in English, and that is, of course, The Way of the World. And the two great characters, Millamant and Mirabell. Their proposal scene is one of the stock examples of what wit is at its shimmering best, when the mind is lighted up like a room full of great candelabras. And there's that great description of marriage, dwindle into matrimony. And after we are married, says Millamant, I will marry you on certain conditions that after we are married, we'll never be seen together because it's not fashionable and so forth. And all of it spoken with an unstifled yawn in the throat, but with the mind working full tilt.
In a sense, Wilde did pretty much the same thing, didn't he?
Wilde did exactly the same thing, only the style, the actual writing of sentence by sentence in Wilde isn't as beautiful from the point of view of the construction of language or the choice of words or the intricacy of expression as it is in Congreve.
That makes him easier to play, I think. And
much easier. That's why The Way of the World, the greatest of the comedies, was a failure even in its own time on the stage. It's a library comedy. What I'm trying to say is that his prose style can possess subtleties which elude an audience and which, by their very intricacies, lose the comic point that a reader can seize upon while enjoying the style itself and these intricacies. May I give you an illustration? This is from Love for Love. In Love for Love, you have some superbly theatrical scenes, easy ones, really, such as the true Miss Prue and Tattle love-making episode, which is farce, of course, on its simplest and most salacious basis, but hilarious. But now let me turn to one of the passages, which is really almost too literary for hearing, though glorious in the reading. This is from Love for Love again, and this is Valentine pursuing Angelica. And would anything but a madman complain of uncertainty, as Angelica? Uncertainty and expectation are the joys of life. Security is an insipid thing, and the overtaking and possessing of a wish discovers the folly of a chase. Never let us know one from another better, for the pleasure of a masquerade is done when we come to show our faces. Now turn from that, which is very involved, really, Jamesian, we would now say, to such simple lines as these from Oscar Wilde. This is from The Importance of Being Earnest. These are easy paradoxes, and you can't help but feel the bell ring at the end of the typewritten line. The amount of women in London who flirt with their own husbands is perfectly scandalous. Or, I hear her hair has turned quite gold from grief. Or, I do not approve of anything that tampers with natural ignorance.
That classic line of his when he was starving in Paris and told a friend, I am dying as I lived beyond my means.
Witty everywhere, witty even as he was when he came to this country, and the customs officer said, what have you declared? And he said, nothing but my genius. Wilde was, of course, the great master of the epigram. And what is it that you call it when you invert sense? Isn't it a spoonerism? An inversion of sense when by mistake you do that? Again and again, Wilde would do that as an epigram. You remember, I'll give you a cruel example because he's so much better than this. The tragedy of every man is that he is not like his mother, The tragedy of every girl is that she is like hers. And that is, it's on his head. He loved to do that. But then he could rise to enormous sense, as in the famous line everybody knows, the definition of a cynic. A cynic is a person who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. But may I come back beyond Wilde for a moment to what has come since Wilde in the epigram? When I was young, Mr. Yeoman, and this is true, Somerset Maugham, heaven knows a profoundly witty man, has confessed this, that when he wrote plays, before he turned to the novel, before he abandoned the theater, Somerset Maugham said that in those days a manager, after the Oscar Wilde period of comedies, expected epigrams. They were then very fashionable, and that managers would send back a script saying, put in 35 more epigrams, please. And they were just fed in, just so you would put something into spaghetti. After the epigram period, which has died, I suppose realism flourished. We came into the 20s and the 30s, into the period of the wisecracking comedy. And I would say that in the older plays, the comedies of good manners, I shall call them, a person insulted almost out of politeness because he was accepting the conversationalist with him as an equal, and you insulted as if you were dueling to release the wit of the other man. The trouble with the wisecracking comedy was that you didn't so much stimulate by your comment as you bludgeoned.
You obliterated.
You clobbered.
Mm-hmm.
You did them in, and there was nothing to do except make funny paper noises, blop, oup, oop, oop, and all the comic noises, and you were dead.
Well, that was the era of the straight man.
That was the straight man, but that is not repartee, and that is not the interchange.
What about Coward? You wouldn't say that Coward was a playwright of the wisecrack, would you?
No, I think
Coward belongs more in the genre of Maugham, a comedy of manners, and
Coward follows Wilde and Maugham in that tradition of English comedy,
just as S.N. Berman did in this country.
Absolutely, but S.N. Berman was in that tradition of high comedy, of social comedy.
Yes,
and that is the comedy of society, of equals speaking as equals and having a chance to ventilate their wit.
Rich speaking to rich.
Well, now that's a totally different thing. If you're going to try to pretend that you disapprove of money, you and I are going to part company right now.
I'm all for it. I just think it's interesting that in almost all cases of the comedy of manners, the high comedy, the characters in those plays, except for the maids and the butlers, are extremely rich people living on their unearned income.
They weren't all. If you wanted to write a social history of England and a decline of a certain society in England, you could write not a main throughway, but at least an alleyway or sideway comment on that decline in terms of what are the changed social values of the high world or upper world of Wilde, Maugham, and Noel Coward, and right down to Terence Rattigan today. And you would see that whereas in Wilde, in this closed world, this hermetically, financially protected world that you were speaking of, you had dukes and duchesses and ladies and an occasional rich American wandering in. But people took no interest, even those who were members of the House of Lords, took no interest in politics. They yawned. They had pleasure as their one pursuit. In Maugham, you'll find professionals are already in the place, professionals who want newspaper notices. And by the time you come to Noel Coward, you've moved straight into the cafe society.
Yes, a few people actually work for a living in Coward.
Well, there are actors and actresses, playwrights. There are people who are working.
But on the whole, successfully.
Oh, enormously, yes. I never knew Chatterton. But when he was starving in a garret, it is my suspicion that he said a very few witty things. I think an absence of food does not necessarily create a presence of wit. Indignation, yes, but not necessarily wit.
When you talk about the wisecrack, I think of a man who, in my opinion, is just about the best who ever lived, and that is Wilson Meisner, who has said some of the funniest things any American has ever said. I think it was he who originated the phrase, never give a sucker an even break, and who described Hollywood as a trip through a sewer in a glass-bottomed boat. And it was he who once, when he was having a drink with a beautiful but cold actress, leaned across the table and said, "Darling, reach into your heart and give me a piece of ice."
On the basis, at least what we're trying to say is, I would put him below the top flight wit.
Distinguishing between him and Charles Lamb, for example, don't you think he was a wit rather than a wisecracker?
He was a humorist, essentially. He is called, and he hated being called, but he was gentle Elia. There was a gentleness there. He had the sense of nonsense. You remember the great ever-quoted line of what he said, this is a pun. He loved puns. He had the proper respect for puns. If ever you hear anyone say that a pun is the lowest form of wit, realize that the person who is speaking is one of the lowest forms of human beings, utterly incapable of getting off a pun or appreciating one. But you remember when one happy and ginny evening, because the influence of high spirits, liquor, on wit is very great in literature and in life.
It helped Lamb,
It
certainly.
has certainly helped Lamb, and in its way it's comparable to what Hemlock was to dear old Socrates. In
I
his
thought
case,
that was a disaster.
it just silenced him eternally, but he certainly said something well that was good
Well,
before he took off.
A mouthful.
A mouthful. But let's go back to Lamb. Do you remember when William Wordsworth had come in from the country, and William Wordsworth was talking about poetry, and Lamb was drinking his gin in the corner, and William Wordsworth apparently said he could write Hamlet. Anybody could write Hamlet if he wanted to. And Lamb, who stuttered, and he stuttered to help his comic points, he said, William says he could have written Hamlet if only he had had the mind to. And that play on mind there is, of course, the whole thing that demolished Wordsworth, sent him back to the Lake Country for that evening.
Maybe it made him poet laureate, who knows?
But Lamb was the one who rose paradoxically because he adored the paradox and the pun together to the defense of comedy of manners of the last century, the artificial comedy. He was the one who said you can't judge these plays morally. He didn't complain because they had too much money or because they lived in a special world of finance or elegance. He said, no, no, no. These people who have gotten out of Christendom into a utopia of cuckoldry, and you must judge them not by police laws, but by what it is that the laws establish with the brilliance of their own speech, and by what is dazzling. And it seems to me that is, though a paradox, perfectly fair. It is always has infuriated the moralists, but the moralists are not happy as a rule in the presence of laughter.
You remind me of another incongruous wit, Sidney Smith. And one reason I think Sidney Smith seems so funny is that Sidney Smith, a minister himself all his life, was so funny about the church, which the moralists could never dream that anybody could be funny about. For example, he said of one tiresome bishop that he deserved to be preached to death by wild curates.
That is a line it's hard to improve. I glibly said the moralist, as a rule, does not laugh. I was, of course, indulging in one of those generalities which cannot be supported, because at heart, Voltaire was a moralist. Now, I'm not talking about his own personal morals, but I'm talking about Voltaire when it came to the indignation he felt at society. And now we come back again to the gentleman from whom we cannot stay away, apparently, and that's Mr. Shaw, one of the wittiest of men who was one of the sternest of Puritan moralists at heart. But he did need the release of laughter because to him laughter was the proof of human sanity, and the failure to laugh was only the failure to recognize what was human error or political ignorance.
He was smart enough to know what an effective weapon humor was in putting his ideas over.
It was the drum that he could beat to lead them to what was the theater of his real seriousness.
Do you feel that of the various forms of wit and humor, the single line, the wisecrack, is one of the most effective? For example, I read the other day about an editor in New York in the 1850s of whom I'd never heard before, named Henry Clapp, Jr., who, when asked his opinion of Horace Greeley, said he is a self-made man who worships his creator.
I like your Mr. Clapp.
I do.
Indeed, I applaud your Mr. Clapp. But that is the single line, and that is covering this one specific situation. I think when we're talking about the great wits, we're not talking about the single line boys. I would say that the wisecrack has almost gone out of favor. It's almost a period piece for the moment. I think we still hunger for the witty line in private life. Let's get beyond wit into what is the general comment. That's what I think we're looking for now. It's not where you have merely the single line that's deflating, but the comment that is instructive. Because this is where laughter really has its educational qualities. Let's take two parallels, two great political satirists. Let's start with Aristophanes, but not stay there too long.
I hope not.
And let's begin with...
Way up in the clouds.
Well, leave the clouds and get down to the frogs. And when you get down to the frogs, which is still quite a farcical ascent, what do you find? You find a play beginning by every invitation to the easiest form of laughter. These invitations are frankly given. Take the first line, for example. Xanthias speaks to Bacchus, and what is the first thing that he says? Master, shall I begin with the usual jokes that the audience always laugh at? If you please, says Bacchus. And Aristophanes then proceeds to begin with exactly those easy jokes that the audience laughs at. You have physical comedy, a man burdened with bundles, dropping them. You have everything that the eye can take in before the mind is employed later in the play. After this hurly-burly of physical comedy, the mechanistic quality that Bergson had in mind, the Frogs begins to lift, and it continues to lift and lift until its last scene, which is one of the greatest pieces of dramatic criticism ever written, the scene in which Aristophanes compares Euripides and Sophocles and Aeschylus. Remember, this was a large audience, and the size of that Greek audience, plus its ability to recognize the subtlest points of parody immediately, gives us some indication of the theatrical knowledge that Greeks brought to their playhouses. Edith Hamilton, in the Greek way, tries to illustrate how contemporary Aristophanes is, and she succeeds, not by merely quoting Aristophanes, but by quoting Gilbert and Sullivan. In other words, the equivalent verses from Gilbert.
Mm-hmm.
And Gilbert had very much the same satiric approach that Aristophanes did. Certainly when it comes to the law, you can find few parodies funnier than Trial by Jury. Certainly if it comes to constables, the policeman's lot is not a happy one, and so forth and so on. When you come to the Navy, I polish up the handle of the big front door. You come to the ultimate in that period.
I must confess I find all three of those gentlemen more instructive than I do amusing at this late date.
I'm not asking you to speak, even I don't speak as a contemporary of Aristophanes, nor do I pretend to speak as one of Gilbert. But I must admit I still am a strong Gilbert and Sullivan fan, and Gilbert particularly.
Well, now, are you talking about him as a lyricist or as a critic of his society? Of course, his plots were asinine, infantile, and tediously improbable.
I must admit I tire of the switch babies and all those things, but the felicity of the rhyme, the kind of high ingenuity in rhyming that Gilbert possessed was genius. It's the kind of thing in our time which fortunately we still have, and we have it in terms of Ogden Nash, who is one of the most adroit versifiers our literature has produced, and hilarious in the process.
Of course, remember that Aristophanes' The Clouds had the unhappy effect, ultimately, after it had been revived, of really indirectly causing Socrates' death, because the Athenians were so appalled by the character of Socrates in that play that they took away his political and social liberties.
You have raised one of the key points about laughter. Because it can murder, it can kill a public reputation. When Alice Longworth said that Dewey resembled the little groom on a wedding cake, she did not help Dewey politically.
That's a fair statement.
I think that is a happy understatement.
When Ickes said that Dewey had thrown his diapers into the ring, remember that one? The wisecrack of demolition.
Well, the wisecrack of demolition certainly is a familiar and a needed weapon in political life, but I was coming back to what is the premise of even the danger of laughter, and that is freedom itself. The moment you find yourself living under dictatorship of any kind, or even under the pressures of conformity, you will find that the right to laugh, the right to dare to ventilate a true opinion or to utter a criticism is curtailed. Years and years ago, when there was a superb musical comedy in this country called Of Thee I Sing, followed by I'd Rather Be Right. This was when Hitler was coming into his power. I used to wish with all my heart that the Germans could see pictures of Mr. Roosevelt. If only Mr. Roosevelt could have sat in a box and watched it, which he would have had he been able to get there. He always enjoyed it as he heard it at the White House. But his enjoyment of the laughter at himself, at his own expense, is the proof of freedom. And this is what Mr. Churchill has been able to take criticism and to give it. This was necessary under the Greeks for Aristophanes. And the amazing thing is that in Victorian England, Gilbert and Sullivan, even with the widow of Windsor, enjoyed the freedom that they did, attacking the Navy in those days, in the great days of the Empire. That probably was the proof of the greatness of the Empire. It was so established that it could stand the attack of laughter.
Don't you think, though, that laughter as a political weapon, by and large, has been suspect in American politics, at least? I'm not talking about the political commentators like Will Rogers, who were never a suspect, because, after all, they weren't running for office. But people like Adlai Stevenson, I think, probably lost a certain amount of support.
Let me correct you on one minor point. Will Rogers did run for president once upon a time. He was put up by Life magazine when Robert Sherwood was the editor. And Bob Sherwood used to turn out a column once a week, supposedly the presidential platform. And Will Rogers loved this. He got $500 a week for it. And he once said it was the first time that Sherwood had done any ghostwriting for a presidential candidate. said, if my copy keeps on being as good as this, I'm going to ask more for it. But Will Rogers was the common sense of America speaking, just the way Twain, out of the books as well as in the books, could be the conscience of America speaking. But now you mention wit in politics. For the commentator, for the cartoonist, the simple fact remains that the practicing politician, as I think Adlai Stevenson discovered, was on dangerous ground when he proved in public to be the witty man that he is in private. Because apparently politicians of either party are supposed, when running for office, to say only the most sententious things in sentences so heavy that they sound as if each word were a load of cement. And the law of gravity is the first law they all succumb to.
Franklin Roosevelt got away with humor, but his was a much more of the belly laugh humor than Stevenson's.
Well, President Roosevelt's public utterances, except when campaigning, his public indulgences in humor were far between. The Fowler speech, the Teamsters Union speech, began humorously. And the
Martin, Barton, and Fish.
In Boston, those things. He did, but that was for the big and easy laugh, the great, quick auditorium laugh. But Mr. Roosevelt, who was a humorous man, was not a witty man in the sense that Mr. Stevenson is.
Mm-hmm.
If you're talking about political figures, one of the realms into which Mr. Stevenson wandered, and I thank the Lord that he did, was irony. But irony, which is beyond wit because it doesn't hit as hard, isn't as sky-written. And because it means that you have to know what is being made fun of first and see through what is the ironical implication. He did get into dangerous ground with irony, because a lot of people don't even understand that you're being funny.
Lincoln incurred all kinds of disfavor from his cabinet and other people for his reliance on wit and humor during the Civil War, which he needed badly as a safety valve. I wouldn't say that Lincoln used irony, though, would you?
He could be in the application of an anecdote. Lincoln drove his own cabinet crazy because, as you well know, Lincoln, in the most desperate moments of the war, would stop a cabinet meeting to tell a story. And the cabinet officers who wanted the business of the day discussed became impatient. And had they listened willingly and carefully, they would have seen the story was saying what was their essential business for them, only saying it humorously. As you say, he did need the release, the safeguard of laughter in his own sanity.
I also suspect he needed release from his cabinet now and then. They were a pretty sober-sided group.
It would have been better had he released his cabinet, I think, or some members thereof. But Mr. Churchill is one of the few men in public life at the present time who did dare to be witty and indulge in irony in public. Mr. Khrushchev, of course, that is low humor. That is the good Russian peasant gag. But Mr. Churchill's wisecracks, gags, comments, call them what you will, in addition to being serious and being superbly eloquent, are as widely quoted almost as his most...
What about current manifestations of humor or forms of humor, such as the so-called sick joke, which apparently has taken the place of the old moron joke?
Well, the sick joke, the best illustration of that I happen to know of, heaven knows there must be thousands, is the almost famous story that goes back to a certain fateful night, and our friend Mr. Lincoln, indeed this time Mrs. Lincoln. Do you remember the sick joke in which the theatrical producer says to Mrs. Lincoln, "Well, I know, but apart from all that, Mrs. Lincoln, what do you think of the show?" That is a sick joke if there ever was one.
Another, I think even sicker joke is this one. The little boy rushes up to his brother and says, "Come look, I just pushed Mummy off a cliff." And his brother says, "Don't make me laugh. My lips are chapped."
Well, that is a kind of happy Chas Adams transferred to words. May I give you the moron joke, which has gone out? But when my children were young, they loved moron jokes. And the one that I always treasured with them was the one, why did the undertaker put the chair in the hearse? To which the answer was, for rigor mortis to set in. And I still find that makes a certain amount of high sense.
Well, how do you explain the rise and fall of, say, the moron joke, or the he-she two-line joke, or the current sick joke?
How do you explain the return of the Empire dress, or the chemise, or anything else? This is merely a question of changing fashion. Fashion is something, whether it's verbal or whether it's made of satin or anything else, it's something that's changing all of the time. And humor has its period manifestation, just as everything else. There's music, any form of writing, or even political campaigning.
True humor really stems out of the whole national attitude at the time, then.
Yeah, humor is a kind of wonderful juice. I mean, a nation bases itself in its humor, so it keeps it roasted, keeps it succulent and happy and tender. Well, may I go back to an author that's very dear to me, and this is Mr. Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens is one of the great humorists by that sheer onrushing Niagara of energy that he had, the exuberance of life that he had superbly.
Pickwick.
Pickwick, oh, certainly Pickwick,
well,
any of the novels has abound with this. But he was not a wit. I can't isolate a line. And the wits, usually, you can break the diamond down and you can get out one sparkler from it. I can't really, at the moment, think of that in terms of Dickens.
I can't think of a great many sharply witty or amusing single-line sentences that Will Rogers said. And yet he was a tremendously humorous man.
You remember Will Rogers' explanation, forgive me for this, of why the subway was built?
No.
So that the people who lived in Brooklyn could go home without being seen.
Well, that's pretty good.
After he had had an audience with the Pope, Will Rogers wrote in his column, he was supposed to say what he thought. He said he thought the Pope was wonderful, the Vatican was wonderful. It lacked just one thing, the woman's touch. And Will Rogers also said at the time of the Oberammergau Passion play, he said he found it very boring and he thought the only reason people sat there for 8 hours was because it was called the Passion play. No, he was detachable, believe me.
We haven't talked about parodies yet as a form of humor.
I suppose one reason, Mr. Hillman, is that good parodies are so scarce. Heaven knows there have been superb ones. Max Beerbohm was the master of parodies in his
time. In that wonderful book, Christmas Garland.
Christmas Garland proves for eternity. In our times, we have had so distinguished parodies as the late Wolcott Gibbs. Certainly his takeoffs of Sinclair Lewis or Henry Luce have the very incredible quality of mimicry being pushed into happy distortion, which distinguishes the best parody. You recognize the original and laugh at it because you see that its faults or excesses have been stressed and pointed. Take, for example, the unforgettable line in Gibbs's famous profile parody of Luce. Who can forget it? Who reads Time magazine? I mean the sentence that Gibbs wrote, which runs, and runs in Timese, backward ran sentences until reeled the mind. Then there is Philip Hamburger's fine parody of John Marquand and his novels. The parody was published as a review in a short volume and employed the flashback technique and the leisurely, observant style that Marquand is famous for. I think the essence of parody is to capture the essence of the original.
So that the parodist's style, if let's say he's mimicking James, is almost exactly as the original was,
well,
and yet just off enough.
Well, the parodist has to have a superb ear, and this is what Sir Max Beerbohm had, of course, preeminently, and Gibbs had to an extraordinary extent. The sense of actually hearing the music, of the original music of the person's prose, or poetry, whatever it may be, and then playing it and giving it some dissonance of comment. And that becomes the parody. That's the distortion I had in mind. Parody is the highest form of compliment. It may wound, it may cause blood to flow in the person being parodied, but people such as Sir Max and Wolcott Gibbs did not parody people who were unimportant. A person had to have enough strength and enough recognizable individual quality to be parodied. Colorless prose cannot be parodied, except for a very short interval, if you're just trying to do bad advertising copy or bad journalism. But the mannered stylists, such as James or Beerbohm or Marquand, the people who have the individual voices, these are the people that can be made fun of in terms of their own voices. And one of the people who has been most parodied in the last 300 years is Mr. William Shakespeare. And sometimes he's been parodied by people who didn't realize that they were parodying him. They have just written bad blank verse and thought they were singing like William.
Most of the time they were simply parodying him.
Parodying is right, absolutely. But parody is a happy exercise of laughter because it demands the very thing that Aristophanes demanded in his critical spoof of birds. It demands instantaneous reader or audience recognition of what is being made fun of. You match your knowledge with what is the fault exposed by the knowledgeable parodist. That's what is bound to happen. That's the recognition pleasure.
Don't you feel that humor has to have some sort of forum, though? Well, we love humor, it's essential to us, and yet, oddly enough, there are not too many places where you can actually find humor. What would we do without the New Yorker today, for example?
I think that the New Yorker, when it comes to maintaining a level of civilized, entertaining and perceptive comment is almost unique in the history of magazine publishing. And I think the test of the New Yorker's taste was the war years. The problem of having to produce once a week, in the midst of worldwide agony and blood spilling, a magazine that dared to comment even humorously on that grief was the final test of how supreme an editor Ross was and how gifted those writers were. We forget also that the New Yorker has, in the midst of all of its humor, delectable humor, has dared to publish some of the finest reporting, war reporting or peace reporting, done in our Times and letters from Paris and London.
I think one reason probably that the New Yorker continues to be a genuinely humorous magazine is that it doesn't insist upon being funny all the time.
The most disastrous thing in the world is to pick up a book when you know that the author has said, this is going to be a funny book. And once you hear the author puffing and panting, having to be funny on every page, then that book condemns itself. It exhausts itself and exhausts you by its own exhaustion. To go back beyond the effort to the length of parody. If you remember in your Birbam, you'll remember how brilliantly short those parodies are, because Birbam recognized, supreme as he was as a parodist, that a reader can only follow parody for a comparatively brief length of time. Parody is not a long, sustained thing.
Well, of course, your man Ogden Nash, more than almost any humorist I can think of, is the very archetype of brevity. Who could ever improve on his candy is dandy, but liquor is quicker?
Well, Ogden Nash, it seems to me, long or short, fat or long, whatever the poems may be, they never hold a point too long. I can't think of an Ogden Nash poem, long or short, that has died on the vine because of this inventiveness of which I spoke. If I may say one thing in conclusion, because we mustn't hold this point too long either, I want to go back, if I can, to the real reason for laughter. We've talked about heart, cruelty, kindness, dismissal. I personally believe the best explanation of laughter that I know of, and this is what makes it more than merely a trivial or passing gag or a flippancy, the best explanation that I know of was given years ago by William Hazlitt when he pointed out that man is the only animal who laughs because he is the only animal that knows the difference between what things are and what they should be.
And what should be at this time is for me to end this discussion by rising to applaud a perfect definition of laughter. Well, now that we've both had the chance to trot out our favorite jokes, Mr. Brown, I should like in our next discussion, literary style can be compared with styles in art, architecture, and music as well.